Hello, darling. Tonight's story is an anecdote from my childhood. Now, as someone who tends to be skeptical of supernatural claims, I leave it for you to interpret the central conceit of this story. Memories play tricks. Young children misinterpret and jump to strange conclusions. I can only attest to how my experience felt and what I believed at the time. Regardless, I hope you enjoy my fond recollections of the haunted house. When I was a young boy, my father's mother lived in a century-old, three-story, craftsman-style house. She and her husband had been restoring it for many years. My father wasn't close to his mother, and so I wasn't close to her either, but trips to her house were always enjoyable. The home was vast and filled with one-of-a-kind embellishments, entirely unlike the small, prefabricated houses I was accustomed to. The entryway had a beautiful tile floor like a mural, where tiny squares in turquoise and orange made vibrant swirling patterns that almost seemed to move in low lighting. There was a bench seat built into a wall in the parlor, with a high-cushioned back and elaborately carved wooden arms. A stained glass window rested in the wall above it. Pocket doors separated the parlor from the formal dining room. There was a full bar in the basement, along with a host of bedrooms, for the upstairs had been made into a separate apartment, though it was vacant, so we had the run of it. There was also an attic, rarely visited, filled with mysterious memorabilia from the unknown people who had lived there before. I never experienced anything strange in the house, though as I grew up I heard many stories about adventures our relatives had there. A ghost once crawled into bed with my grandmother, with her thinking it was her husband, until she heard him turn on the shower in another room. Only when she turned over and touched the stranger did he vanish. One of my aunts had been accosted by the apparition of an old man in a bathrobe, shouting angrily but making no sound, who disappeared like smoke when she spoke to him. And members of the family had also reported lapsing into daydreams and, upon coming to, finding that they'd written nonsensical messages that seemed to come from somebody else. Still, while nothing happened to me inside the house, one odd thing did happen to me during a visit when I was about 5 years old. Next to my grandmother's house was an even older Victorian mansion. From my earliest memory, everyone simply called it the haunted house. It was ornate and Gothic, and had clearly been beautiful, but it was by then in ruins. Its lead paint was chipping and peeling, shingles and shutters were missing or barely holding on. The wraparound porch was quite literally hanging off, clearly unsafe. The front yard, more clover than grass, was kept mowed. However, the back garden was a maze of thistle and sunflowers. A dry fountain sat in the center, surrounded by crumbled benches and statues missing heads or arms, their sublime forms covered by vines. Black Victorian-style lampposts dotted the walk, but they had long ago succumbed to rust and stood dark. As a child, I didn't have the vocabulary to describe things like time periods, but I knew the house was very old, and while I wasn't sure quite how long ago it must have been, I could imagine a lady in white, in a broad hat with a parasol, walking on the arm of a young man in a bold striped suit, a straw boater on his head. They would be young, rich, with their whole lives ahead of them. Did they still live in the ruined house? How old would they be now, I wondered. My parents were curious about the house too, and asked my grandmother about it. A comment was made one night about one of the old people having died and roaming the mansion as a ghost, while the survivor kept their body concealed in the home. The adults were joking about my grandmother living next to a Mrs. Bates situation. But then either my mother or my father asked, "We're sure that's not really the case, right?" As my grandmother hadn't actually seen either the old man or the old woman in years. And from that moment on, I couldn't stop wondering about the unseen old people. I was desperate to know the truth. I was vaguely aware of Psycho and the surprise reveal of the mummified Mrs. Bates, and as many small children secretly are, I was fascinated by the macabre. I very much wanted there to be a dead old lady in the house, still draped in her spoiled finery, doted on by an ancient husband whose grip on reality had failed him. Perhaps she was propped up in a chair, held together by wires, or maybe she was laid out on the bed and the old man slept next to her each night, or maybe he was sane enough to know that what he did was shameful, and so he kept her old bones in a hidden room. The details hardly mattered. I just wanted it to be real because it was too fascinating not to be. I was really an extremely timid and well-behaved child, but I was also intensely curious, and the mysteries of the haunted house were simply too great to ignore. So, one summer evening, while my parents and grandmother were talking and playing cards, and I was meant to be playing at the back door, I decided all of a sudden that now was the time. I was going to know the truth. The sun was setting, but it wasn't yet completely dark. Lights were coming on inside houses up and down my grandmother's street. Across the way was a park that dated back to Edwardian times, and I could hear frogs among the trees. I looked up at the back of the haunted house, at the ruined goddesses in Dead Fountain, and I shivered. Was I really going to do this? I saw how easy it would be to slip through my grandmother's vegetable garden and onto the brick driveway of the mansion. From there, it was just a few yards to the mansion's back steps, then onto that sloping porch from where I could easily look into the windows. I went for it. I crawled through the garlic and potatoes onto the ruined brick drive. There was always a beautiful car sitting there, a golden car unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I later learned it was called a Stutz Blackhawk and was the height of luxury. That extremely rare car, a favorite of people like Lucille Ball and Elvis Presley, had been produced in the 1970s and was likely the last big purchase the old people ever made. I wonder now how long that beautiful golden car sat there. The brick driveway was absurdly uneven and grown through with weeds, very treacherous to step on. It's hard to imagine such fragile elderly people navigating it safely. Yet it also seems in my memory that the car was always pristine. I made my way to the back steps of the porch, which were cracked and sagging heavily to one side. And then I was on the porch itself, leaning at perhaps a 30-degree angle, like the deck of a sinking ship. It looked like even the slightest added weight, such as that of a 5-year-old child perhaps, might be enough to rip it from its moorings. But thankfully the moorings held, and I made my way to a bay window. Lights were on inside the haunted house. I looked inside eagerly, and while the scene was partially obscured by a gauzy white curtain, there was still so much to take in. Again, as a little boy, I didn't have the vocabulary to describe what I saw. I knew only that it was something from another time. But I can say now that it was like a scene out of the Roaring Twenties, the age of jazz and the flapper and prohibition. To my left was a parlor lit by a Tiffany lamp. There were black panels on the walls, painted delicately with scenes of peacocks and leopards. The centerpiece of the room was a wicker chair, almost a throne, with a high back that fanned out to frame whoever might sit there. To my right was a formal dining room. A large hutch contained fine dishes and a silver tea set. There was a record player, the old-fashioned gramophone kind with a crank and a big horn on it, like I'd only ever seen in cartoons. And straight ahead was a doorway framed with elegant curtains in peacock blue and dappled with golden beads. The light came from a chandelier and was clear but subdued. It was elegance, glamour, and entirely from some other world. Then, suddenly, a woman stepped into view from the right. I don't think she was especially tall, but she looked tall because she stood straight and she was very thin. She wore a white gown that sparkled and came all the way up her neck, and she was thoroughly bejeweled. Her hair was wavy and a white gold color, and it fanned out to her shoulders. I saw her hands, but only for a split second. They were so white and so thin and small that in my surprise and terror I convinced myself that they were the hands of a skeleton. The lady passed through the curtained doorway into the central hall of the house and disappeared from my view. There was further movement off to my right. Perhaps someone else was following behind the lady, or maybe it was only a trick of the light. I don't know, but at this point I was scared. The woman I had seen, clearly very old, was such a creature of another time, and so out of place in my 1980s reality that I could only see her as a ghost. Remember, I was very young. My mother's parents, only in their 50s then, were refugees with thick accents who had survived World War II and seemed like artifacts from another age to me. So someone of this old woman's vintage was a sight I could barely process. To me, she was a ghost, plain as that, and I was appropriately afraid. So I retreated from the window, over the sloping porch, down the crumbling steps, across the brick driveway, through the garlic patch, and back to my grandmother's yard. It was full dark now, and I was still alone outside. Yet as I stood within reach of my grandmother's back door, and could clearly hear the talking and laughter of my family, I felt safe again. I was certain that the unnatural beings within the haunted house couldn't pursue me here, or at least they wouldn't dare to. That would require them to expose themselves, and somehow that would break their power or make them go away. I felt this instinctively. I had won. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd done for many years. It wasn't that I feared punishment. My parents would have scolded me for looking at someone's window, for going onto a stranger's property, for wandering off alone. But what I did was so unlike me that I think they would have perceived the power of my fascination and would have wanted to know what I'd seen and how I interpreted it. Indeed, when I told my mother this story 4 decades on, she could only remark on the nerve of her normally timid child and her shock that I'd been so secretive. I continued to occasionally hear about the unseen old people as the years went by. It was never clear which of the two was still alive or if both of them were alive. It was only known that someone was still there and that relatives came by once in a while to bring supplies and mow the weedy front yard. Then, when I was a teenager, it was said that the old man had still been there alone, but he had finally died at some point in his 90s, which is still very old now, of course, but was incredibly old then, almost unnaturally old. I hadn't been to my grandmother's place in years by that point, but I still thought about the haunted house. I was sure it would be torn down once both old people died, but fortunately, while the beautiful car was sold, the house survived. In fact, it was restored and ended up being passed from one set of loving hands to the next over the following decades, with each new owner doing more to restore the place to its original glory. The house is almost unrecognizable now when compared to the ruin of my childhood. The facade has been restored, porch and steps have been replaced, but the important elements, like the carriage stone in the sidewalk for stagecoach passengers to step out onto, or the beautiful stained glass panels in some of the windows are still present. The fountain runs again, the lamps glow after dark, and the goddesses have regained their original nubile forms. In the 2020s, during another period of restoration, a hidden room was found in the cellar of the house. It made the local news. The room had almost certainly been used to conceal alcohol during Prohibition. Maybe the old couple never shared the secret of the room with anyone. Or maybe once all their friends knew of it, but none of them remained. There wasn't much inside the room at the time of discovery. Dry keg, few racks for bottles, and an old trunk. Inside the trunk were the remains of a straw boater hat and a lady's parasol, plus a stack of neatly bound love letters from the old man to his wife. The earliest letters had been mailed during their courtship in the 1920s. The husband kept writing love notes to his wife forever after, and she kept saving them. It was clearly a very sweet romance that they shared. The final letters were dated from the late 1970s, which is apparently when the old woman died. The only problem, of course, is that I saw her through her window more than 5 years after that. I said at the outset that I tend to be skeptical of supernatural claims, and yes, that skepticism extends to my own story. Still, I'll never forget my moment of throwing caution to the wind, acting so wildly out of character, and charging into what, for me, was the lion's den. I've often had dreams of buying the haunted house, living there, and uncovering more of its secrets, like the hidden room from Prohibition. I'm sure there's more to find. Perhaps one night I'd get up for a glass of water and see a grand and bejeweled lady gliding through my kitchen. I'd be startled, certainly, but I could hardly be upset. In my mind, new owners might come and go, but that house will always be hers to haunt, whoever she is. Besides, we've met before. Until next time, don't forget me, n'est-ce pas?